A Swedish employee had to reread the question twice because for one confused second, she genuinely thought it said illiterate. That's how rare it is for this specific compliment to land on American ears. And by the end of the thread, it stopped being a compliment at all. It turned into something closer to a survival requirement. Her company in Sweden had just been bought out by an American tech giant, and a wave of new colleagues arrived from the US. What struck her wasn't their job titles. It was how casually they talked about money, not the executives. Regular employees seemingly all knowing a lot about taxes, retirement accounts, and investing, in a way she hadn't seen among her European coworkers. She wasn't being sarcastic. She meant it as a genuine compliment, and said as much she'd even started investing in stocks herself after watching how her American colleagues talked about it. And that sincerity is exactly what threw the entire American side of the thread off balance. Because normally threads about Americans and money go in one very predictable direction, and this one very obviously wasn't going there. One of the very first replies just said, dryly, "Upvote for not asking why we are illiterate." Someone else admitted they had to reread the title because their brain was already braced for an insult that never came. Another compared the confusion to finally getting a compliment after years of being told, in their words, that all Americans care about is money. This is the part that gets me about this thread. A whole country's collective instinct kicked in at once, and it was defensive, not proud. Multiple people described treating this sincere compliment almost like an insult anyway, purely out of habit. Once the surprise wore off, though, the actual explanation came pouring in, and it wasn't flattering. It was structural. The single most repeated word in that entire thread was survival. Multiple people said some version of the exact same thing. Americans aren't smarter with money. They're cornered into learning it because the alternative is genuinely running out of it later in life with nobody catching them. Here's the number that keeps the whole system running. Most American employers stopped offering traditional pensions decades ago and replaced them with something called a 401k, an account where the employee decides how much to contribute, decides what it's invested in, and carries all of the risk personally. One commenter laid out the real math. You can put up to $24,500 a year into that account, pre-tax, another $7,000 into a separate Roth IRA, and if you have kids, another $5,000 per child into a tax advantage education account. Miss those numbers year after year, and retirement simply doesn't happen on schedule. Compare that to the fully funded government pension a lot of Europeans grow up expecting, and the contrast looks stark on paper, except one commenter with German relatives pushed back on that entire assumption. The actual payout from state pensions in parts of Europe is a lot closer to the American Social Security check than people assume, and several of those national systems are under exactly the same kind of long-term strain. And retirement is really only step one of this whole equation. There's a second, messier layer that almost nobody outside the country has to deal with at all. Health insurance in the US is overwhelmingly tied to your job. Lose the job, and in a lot of cases, you lose the coverage on the same day. One person described a college where mass layoffs happen with zero warning the morning they happen, no severance guaranteed, unemployment benefits capped at around 6 months. And after that, you're entirely on your own. Multiple commenters put the same blunt phrase almost word for word. I am my own safety net. Then there's the annual tax return itself, which turns into its own unpaid financial education. In a lot of countries, the government pre-calculates what you owe and mails you a one-page form to confirm it. In the US, the IRS actually already has most of that information, but taxpayers still have to independently calculate and file their own return, because deductions like charitable donations, medical costs, or side income, the government can't see all shift the final number. One person didn't mince words about why that system stays so complicated. Tax preparation companies lobby every single year to keep it that way, rather than let the government simply tell you the number. This is the part that stuck with me the most. An entire industry built specifically to profit from a confusion that in a lot of other countries simply doesn't exist as a problem to be solved. Now, a few people in the thread pumped the brakes here, and their objection is worth taking seriously, because the sample size in this story is quietly rigged. Several commenters pointed out correctly that Americans sent to work in a European office aren't a random slice of the country. They're specifically the ones with a passport, an in-demand skill set, and a company willing to relocate them, which already filters out a huge chunk of the population. One person summed it up bluntly: the average American delivering an Amazon package that same afternoon almost certainly isn't thinking about his Roth IRA contribution limit. And that split showed up constantly in the replies. One commenter, working in personal finance, described the country as roughly two separate groups: people who understand the entire financial system and actively play it to their advantage, and people who don't even realize their savings are quietly losing value to inflation every single month, sitting untouched in a regular checking account. A middle group exists too: automated retirement contributions, target date funds, set it and forget it investing, but the gap between the two extremes is enormous, and it isn't evenly distributed by income either. And that unevenness matters because it's not really a story about intelligence at all. It's a story about who can actually afford to play the game in the first place. One commenter framed it almost like a formula. The American financial system has a genuinely high ceiling and a genuinely low floor. Learn the tax code, understand compound interest, max out the right accounts early, and the payoff can be dramatically larger than in most other countries. Miss all of that, or simply never have enough spare income to participate, and there's very little underneath you to catch the fall. Somewhere in Europe, the exact opposite trade-off is usually true: a much higher floor, but a noticeably lower ceiling. And there's a genuinely sympathetic detail buried in the middle of it. One person, 8 years into a finance-adjacent career, admitted flat out that despite understanding the numbers professionally, they still have zero personal desire to play the game. Someone gently pointed out, not unkindly, that not playing while having the means to is its own kind of expensive mistake. A piece of financial literacy advice most Americans have simply had drilled into them since childhood, whether or not they act on it. So circle all the way back to that Swedish employee's genuine, sincere compliment. By the end of the thread, Americans are financially literate wasn't really a compliment about intelligence anymore. It was closer to a diagnosis of a system: thin social safety nets, employer-tied health insurance, a self-managed retirement account with real dollar limits attached, and a tax system complicated enough to sustain an entire industry built around explaining it back to you for a fee. Learn all of that early, and it looks a lot like financial genius from the outside. Skip it, and the same country that produces confident 20-something investors also produces people working full-time who are one missed paycheck away from serious trouble. Same system, wildly different outcomes, depending entirely on who got taught the rules early and who got left to figure it out alone. It's a strange kind of literacy to be proud of, honestly. Not, I understand money because I find it fascinating. Closer to, I had to learn this on a deadline because nobody else was going to do it for me. If a compliment about spreadsheets can accidentally expose an entire country's safety net, wait until you hear the real reason Americans can casually die without ever seeing the ocean or leaving their own state. Same underlying theme, completely different scale. Tell me in the comments, does your country teach personal finance in school, or did you have to figure it out the hard way too?